historical stuff. And how much do you know about the origins of this marvellous old grandstand?
Well, I suppose if you want to talk about the old grandstand, it's worth first of all talking about the old grandstand, because you go back to the early part of the 20th century. This was just a field, literally a farmer's field that the football club leased and played games on. And it was only when we went professional in 1908 that the decision was taken to develop the ground and start putting proper spectator facilities in. And part of that first development of the ground was the building of a wooden grandstand ready for the joining the Southern League in 1908. So the first grandstand, the old grandstand, was a small wooden structure. And it's interesting because it's different from what we've got here in that, like quite a few grandstands at the time, there was the stand, and then there was a terrace in front of the stand. So if you look at pictures of the old grandstand, you see people sitting in the seats, and there's some wonderful photographs, particularly I think of women dressed with wonderful hats and things like that. And then in front, you see people standing in an enclosure in front of the old grandstand. So that's a big difference how the ground was first. I understand that grandstand was then extended in about 1911, 1912, around then, so it was enlarged. And that was pretty much how that stand was up till the First World War, which the ground was then started to be used for other purposes while people were away fighting. And then initially, when football restarted, and of course we joined the Football League in 1920, and so the old grandstand was used in those early league days. But in 1925, disaster struck, and people in the local area suddenly saw smoke billowing out of the stand. Apparently quite a crowd gathered and basically watched the old grandstand destroyed by fire very, very quickly, absolutely crumbled down in the heat. They think that they'd been drying shirts far too near to a fire, and that the shirts had caught fire, and so everything was lost, including all the players' kit. But what amazes me is that 4 days later they still played a game here. It was a Southern League game against Weymouth, and they put tents up for the players to change in. And I think Exeter played Swansea in the Cup a couple of weeks later, and there were tents for the players to use at half time. They also used, I think Swansea used a premises in St James's Road, and Exeter changed in the Red Lion pub. So the fire didn't stop them. So that was a sad end to the old grandstand. But they took advantage. I think they wanted to develop the ground anyway. There'd been thoughts to build a new grandstand. It was around that time, 1925, that the cowshed over the far side was first built. So they were developing the ground so it was bigger and better for league football. So they replaced the one that burnt down with this structure that we see here now. And that was built in 1926. It was delayed by the general strike, so but it was there for the start of the 26-27 season. And it was built with around 2,000 seats. That's what they reported at the time, would have been wooden benches. So it was quite a sizable stand. And it also had things like changing rooms, club offices, get certain club facilities built into it. So that was in 26. That was in effect quite a modern stand, and here we are now, and it's still here.
Fantastic. That's a great introduction.
Was that too long?
Well, yeah, we'll edit it as
do you
required.
want shorter bits, or is it
Do you
okay
want
just to talk?
should we do some shorter little snippet
Yeah.
bits?
Yeah.
So if we do we'll do it in sections. So we do a short snippet bit about if disaster strikes Birmingham down. Go for that?
Yep. So the old grandstand was used for the early days of league football, and then disaster strikes, and the local people spot smoke billowing from the old grandstand, and by all accounts some shirts that were being put out to dry were too near to a fire. They caught alight, and very soon the whole building burnt down. So that was a sad end to the first grandstand at St James's Park.
That's cool. And a little bit actually what would be quite good is how they use that as an opportunity to rebuild and modernise and connect it with the development of the cowshed. That would be quite good.
Yeah. I mean, in those early days in the Football League, there clearly was a desire to redevelop the ground and improve it. So in 1925 you saw the construction of the old cowshed with covered terracing, and there were plans to build a new grandstand anyway. So the new grandstand that was built following the fire was clearly, you know, built to modern standards. It included changing rooms and offices and room for about 2,000 people to watch.
Bang on, spot on. So that's sort of the early history, that covers that quite nicely for us. I want to do a little bit about the Sunderland match, what you know about the Sunderland. So basically in the context of the busiest this place has probably ever been, was when the record crowd, the Sunderland game. I think like something along those lines, just sort of, yeah.
I mean, the furthest that Exeter City have ever got in the FA Cup was in the 30-31 season. And we got to the sixth round, drawn away at mighty Sunderland at Roker Park. And I think Exeter caused quite a surprise by getting a 1-1 draw there. So that was a big occasion in the northeast. But that meant there was a replay here at St James's Park. And I think there was cup fever, because we'd already been drawn in the semi-final of the FA Cup. Can you imagine that? Exeter City in the semi-final of the FA Cup. So we were there as Exeter City or Sunderland. So there was cup fever in Exeter, and the reported attendance is over 20,000, which is, it's hard to believe now that people could cram in here. I mean, I've been in a kind of 16 to 18,000 crowd here, so I know what you could cram people in. And when you've got large terraces, you know, you can fit a lot of people in. But that would have been, you know, an early example of this place absolutely rocking it. It was probably the first big event for the old grandstand, which would have been packed to the rafters alongside the rest of the ground.
Perfect. Now more sort of towards your own personal opinions and memories of the old grandstand. Have you ever watched games from over here?
I have. In fact, in my time, I've watched football in all four sides of the ground. So I probably started off in the Big Bank to watch games there. But I had some friends who used to watch from the St James's Road end. That used to be a home terrace. So I started joining them there, and I'd watch the games from there. I remember watching a young Ian Rush scoring against us for Liverpool in the League Cup when he was very early on in his career, and just being right in front of him scoring. And then a couple of those friends were quite elderly, and they actually switched to the old grandstand, and I said I'd join them. So for 2 or 3 years I quite regularly watched from the old grandstand. I can particularly remember sitting here, and Alan Ball was the manager at the time. I remember seeing him, and he came down at half time muttering all the way down here about their goal was offside. And I remember just absolutely seeing him, because he was an absolute icon World Cup winner, and there he was moaning and bellyaching about the referee. So you were always quite close up here with the action for the managers. And then over time I went back to the Big Bank, and then I watched my football over there in the old grandstand, looking over here. But I've always I suppose, come here for individual games for certain reasons. So, I mean, one that's personally I always remember very well is I brought my wife here to watch us play Spurs in a friendly in 1985, early August 1985, and she was heavily pregnant. And a couple of weeks later, my first daughter was born, Sarah. A few years later, I took Sarah to her first ever match here. In fact, I took her with a school party from Newtown School. And like, she was probably only about 6-7 years old at the time, and like a lot of young kids, it's amazing how hungry and thirsty they get during the match. I remember we were playing Blackburn Rovers at home, so in the end I weakened and took her up the steps there to the catering, and I can remember this roar go up as I got the food, and that was the only goal of the game, so I missed that. So personally that was quite a memory. I watched football here with my dad. He was a Londoner, but he used to come down every now and again to stay with us, and I'd take him to football. And I remember watching City play Brentford in the FA Cup with him, and Dick Forbes getting the only goal of the game for Exeter City with a stunning volley to the big back end. The only time I ever went in the old director's box was also a Brentford match. A good friend in Exeter who was a big Brentford supporter. Was a guest of the directors and took me out as a guest. Season Brentford got promoted, and that was quite an eye-opener because even though I'd been in the stand, I'd never been behind, so I didn't know what was below the stand. And suddenly these rooms opened up. So there was a little director's room where we were, and then food was served at the end. And I remember the directors, saying, "You've got to eat this, you've got to go," and this great big buffet had been served up, and then the visiting management team came in and things like that. So that was quite an eye-opener. And I think one of the other games that I particularly remember was that I watched from here was the Brazil game in 2004. So I remember that very strong. It was a wonderful occasion, and I remember watching with my family at the far end of the old grandstand that game.
A little bit. I think if we do like a character piece, the Brazil game is quite a unique one. The centenary game. So you can sort of run through that, what it was like in here and around the ground.
I think if you go back to the year we played Brazil, 2004, so that was the end of our first season as a non-league team. It's hard now to remember just how low we'd got as a club, but how good we were starting to feel about ourselves. The Sports Trust had taken over the club, we were still going, and at the end of that first season I think there was a real feeling of we've survived, we're building the club again, and then to play Brazil at the end of that season was really exciting, and it was a wonderful day. It was the end of the season, a nice warm day. And there was Brazilian music being played, samba bands on the pitch. It was just a lovely atmosphere, and I think when you suddenly saw Dunga, the guy who lifted the World Cup, going out there and shaking hands with Glenn Cronin, and you suddenly thought, this is amazing. This is little old Exeter City with one of the giants of world football. Now the Brazil manager, of course. So I think there was a real feeling of pride that day, and at that point I think still the Brazil story hadn't quite caught on, but that gave it a real boost, and I think it was following that people said, wow, 2014, we've got to really make the most of that, and I think we did, but that's where it started that day. So it was a day of immense pride in Exeter City.
Super, fantastic. Because you mentioned Dunga, so it makes me think about Dunga, Ronaldo, George Best. Over the years, despite being a small club, we have the old grandstand and the stadium as a whole has witnessed some superstars of football.
Absolutely.
What do you think they would, I mean, you can't speak for them, but what do you think they would make of this stand, this stadium, and what did this stadium think of them in return?
Yeah.
I think.
Well, I think it must be a culture shock for top footballers to come here. I think of Liverpool in the season just gone, having to come down and change in our ancient 1926 changing rooms. That must be a massive culture shock. What I do think is that football fans are the same the world over. They love to see superstars. So I think it's been one of the things that's given people in Exeter immense pleasure to be able to sit here and watch some of the great games of football. So we might often be playing in the lowest level of football, but when you actually add up the list of great footballers that have played here, fantastic. It really does add up. Of course, some of them were great footballers who started off here. So if you think in our early history, people like Dick Pym, Cliff Baston, absolute, they'd be massive superstars today. They played on this pitch. Local boys that people saw and loved at St James's Park. And then right the way through history, obviously, amazing number of famous footballers that have played here. I think that Manchester United team that came here in '69, it just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? Best, Law and Charlton. I mean, George Best. To think that people paid a few bob and came in here and saw George Best, the iconic footballer. And, that's gone on through the years. Lots of famous players that have played here. Famous Liverpool players through the years. People like Ian Rush, for example. People like Suarez, top players played here. Obviously, the Manchester United team that came here in 2005 with Ronaldo and Rooney and Giggs and people like that. If you think young David Beckham played here on loan with Preston, so sometimes you were watching people, you didn't know they were going to be superstars, so you never quite know who you're watching. We all pick out players. I like the look of him. Never hear of them again, but just occasionally. I'll be interested whether anyone that day when Preston played here, did they say, "Oh, that Beckham looks okay"? I don't know, but fantastic. Trevor Francis, first ever £1 million player, made his debut here in Nicky Jennings' testimonial. The names go on. Fantastic that football does provide those opportunities.
We asked Dave this morning about the importance of heritage at a football club. So I'm thinking in terms of all the different projects that we're doing. And Dave was talking in terms of the tours. And so really thinking in terms of how heritage of a ground, how it feels and how it's created and all that kind of thing. And it's not really a question, it's more of a, would you care to muse about that, the significance of heritage, the importance of what we're doing, how much you enjoy it, how much you can feel it, etc.
I think the heritage of football is central to the enjoyment of the sport, because essentially at the end what you've got is your memories, and it's the collection, the presentation, the celebration of those memories that gives people so much pleasure. Just looking at old photographs, at old memorabilia, and it will trigger wonderful memories and thoughts. It could be of a player you've enjoyed, it could be a bit of the ground that you've enjoyed, it could be a game you've enjoyed, it could be smell of the ground, the noise in the ground. It can be multitude of things, and for different people it's different things. But if it's just constantly in the present, I think that's pretty one-dimensional, and I think most of us are multi-dimensional, and we need and enjoy putting things in context, remembering things, and I think that's why the work we're doing at the club on heritage is so important. I think it's fantastic what we've done in quite a short time to really help people enjoy their football club.
That's a brilliant answer. Yeah, thank you for that. And now more your own personal memories. We asked Dave this morning, we're going to do the same with everyone, of key occasions that you remember. You've talked about Brazil already, but is there a particular time where this stadium or this football club's been at its absolute very best for you?
It's interesting that you have all sorts of memories from your first memory of the ground, and I was a student at the university, and I remember decided to come down and watch a game, and my first problem was I couldn't find the ground. I was used to grounds with massive great floodlights, and I was looking around for these big floodlights, and when you come down from the university you can't see the ground. So I was kind of wandering around I knew it was down the street somewhere, but so I was late into the ground, and I went and stood on the big bank, and literally within seconds from me going on the ground, Fred Binney bore down on goal and whammed it into the net against Stockport. I thought, oh, this is very good. So sometimes you just get an early trigger there that you think, oh, I'm going to enjoy this. I suppose inevitably you go back to promotion-winning seasons. Obviously I wasn't around the 63-64 season, but I was lucky, hardly come to Exeter, and Exeter get promoted in 76-77, and there was a lot of joyous kind of games in that kind of running. Although, it's funny how your memory, I don't know if it plays tricks, or I can just remember some of the games were just real slogs. I remember we beat Halifax 1-0, I think, and they kicked us off the pitch, and it was just horrible. It would just never be allowed today. But they were down to 9 men in the end. They had 2 sent off, and somehow we won 1-0. But I can just remember thinking, God, this level division football's pretty harsh stuff. But then, getting promoted. Although I think some of the great games in that one were away, and I didn't see them. But I remember we just churned out results at home. Then 88-89. I watched a lot of, and we actually won the league that year, and there was those 3 games at the end of the season when we clinched promotion at home, because we didn't lose all season at home. It was extraordinary. Won about 20 games, drew 3, had cup runs, played Sunderland. Amazing how Sunderland come back in history. Sunderland were there that season. Last season we played Sunderland, so we've had some titanic struggles with them. So that was great, as was the 2 promotions from the conference, and then League 2 to League 1. But it's funny how, as a football fan, your mind, it doesn't just deal with the victories or the famous people. I mean, I can remember, my memory of it is that it was a night game, maybe a Friday night game, against Cambridge. And it was the coldest I have ever been at a football match. I was standing on the old big bank and absolutely froze. And the crowd that night, I think it was 1,300. I think it was about our lowest ever league crowd. And it was just a dreadful 0-0 draw. And we froze. And you realise that is part of it as well. It's not all glory. It can be really miserable at times as well.
Fantastic. Yeah, you're talking about the it's not always glory, and I was thinking you also mentioned about sort of the comeback years, and I wondered if you'd do sort of a little bit about that. Some people would call them the Tisdale years, and other people would call them the trust years, but I would call them the sort of the comeback years, I guess, where we've hit our lowest point, and then we sort of the trust. You talked earlier about the confidence, and how this it was almost as if this old standard seen everything, and then suddenly we have this period, and if you do it sort of in the context of this old standard seen everything, that would be quite interesting.
I mean, this old grandstand had seen a lot of things through its history, but one thing it hadn't seen until 2003, it hadn't seen Exeter City get relegated to out of the league. It's had a fair few close scrapes, but 2003, last game of the season, we were at home to Southend, and we had to better Swansea, who were playing Hull City, their score, and it was 0-0 here, and after a bit of time, Hull scored, and then I think Hull went 2-1 up, and they were, suddenly you thought, my God, we may sneak out of it, and then slowly but surely, this is pre-mobile phones and internets then, so it was, people were probably listening on radios and things like that, and then we heard that Swansea had equalised and then went 3-2 up and 4-2 up, and we suddenly realised we were going out the league, and dear old Flacky scored right at the last minute, so we actually won the game 1-0. We won our last 3 games that season, but still got relegated, and I think we were in shock. I mean, it was 9,000, it was an absolute sellout. And I can remember, watched the game over in the grandstand opposite, and remember just at the end, people, it went very, very quiet, and then people just totally unplanned walked onto the pitch, and it was like some funeral parade, and I can remember people, very little said, but people wanted to be out there, and they just wandered, and we just spent time kind of reflecting, and think of so many people there with their different memories. They must have all been buzzing, and we were very, very low. I mean, that was as a football club, it's all about winning, not getting relegated, and that was a big blow. And it's probably a bigger blow then than it might be for clubs now, in the sense that so many clubs have now been relegated, but that was the early days of automatic relegation. There was some shame, and there was, but also we knew that the club wasn't being properly run. So, I mean, frankly, at that stage, it was either go bust, or Phoenix-like, build out of the ashes. And I think it's so brilliant, the people that got together, built the trust up, took over ownership of the club for the next season, and what then emerged over the next few years was utterly down to that vision and that commitment at the time. Kind of a couple of seasons really getting to grips with conference life and rebuilding the club, and then fantastic moments like drawing Manchester United in the FA Cup, starting to bring the finances into the club, the arrival of Paul Tisdale for the 2006-07 season, going to Wembley, the new Wembley for the first time, some, suddenly, compared to moping on the pitch after the Southend game in relegation, suddenly we felt good about the club again, and I think the old grandstand, if it had shed a tear when we got relegated, was smiling again, and I think the next few years were some of the happiest, probably, those of us that have been around Exeter City for a long time have ever enjoyed. It's one of the tragedies of some of those conference years was the great games were all away from here. So we lost here both times in the semi-finals.
That's true.
And then one at Oxford and at Torquay, so it wasn't all played out here.
No,
well, bits of it were.
It's all part of it, isn't it? How would you? I was thinking about. I say this to Elliot quite a lot, that each of these stands has a different character, and I think that's got something to do with the fact it's not an identity; it's an old-fashioned stadium. And so often, if you know the identikit stadium, it's quite a harsh term for it, the mould stadium, they feel the same all the way around. Then if you get a nice square stadium, you have different characters. But here it's even more special because everything is slightly separated.
Yeah.
How would you define the character of the old grandstand?
I mean, I think in some senses, though not obviously not in others, this is much more like a cricket ground with lots of distinct stands. And on most cricket grounds, there's the oldest bit, which is kind of the bit that everyone has a bit of reverence about, and it's, you know, that's the bit of the ground that's seen all the history. And I suppose the old grandstand is like that. And I think that for me, it's not just its age and what it's seen, but it's also, particularly if you're over opposite it, I think it's a unique vista in football. So to have, to see the streets and the hills behind it, it really feels part of the town and the city. It feels like a real community grandstand embedded in the community. I love things like it's got its own railway station, and you can hear the trains tootling past during the matches, and the fans who are driving the trains tooting, and it is quite unique, much loved, and I think it's brilliant that we're trying to remember as much about it as possible.
Fantastic. We talked earlier about it being like a rabbit warren inside, so I don't know if you could sort of describe it, or even describe the first time, like we talked before, like the first time you realised, is this familiar, is this familiar, anything that particularly stands out for you beneath the stadium?
It was a real shock to me the first time I went underneath the old grandstand, because for most of my years here, I'd never been behind the scenes here, had no reason to. So when I first went there, I was kind of, wow, there's all this here. And I suppose what I love about it is it's very higgledy-piggledy. There's lots of different rooms. I mean, you only have to go down the tunnel, and you've got away changing room, home changing room, referees changing room, then you've got the physio room, and you've also got the tea room where Jurgen Klopp famously did his interview with our tea ladies watching on. So before you've even got very far, you've got 5 very different rooms, all doing different things. Then you go beyond that, and you suddenly realise, there's these giant spaces with little cupboards and little bits that all had a variety of purposes, from being a player's lounge, director's lounge, offices, etc., etc. And it is just a rabbit warren under there, and drips with history and the way things used to be. I mean, it's an antithesis to how you build a modern grandstand.
Superb, fantastic. A couple more to round us up then. This is a lovely content. Have I asked you what the best thing you've ever seen is? I can't remember, on the roll now. The single best thing you've ever seen at St James's Park? I asked Dave this morning. It's such a horrible question to single something out.
It's a really, really good question.
It's tough, isn't it?
I mean, there's been lots of amazing moments that have resonated with me. I guess one that it was the first time for a long time that I'd seen this stadium go absolutely mad was in our first season back in League One, and we went into our last game home to Huddersfield, facing relegation. Went 1-0 down very early in the game, equalised, but we needed to win, and the clock was ticking, and I think it was with about 8 minutes to go, Ryan Harley scored, and we avoided relegation. But the reaction to that goal and to the final whistle was sensational, and I think that was a release valve from those years of first suffering and then rebuilding the club, back-to-back promotions, into League One with a squad that was in effect a conference squad. Not surprisingly, finding it difficult, but playing some brilliant football here. But it was tough, and to hear the stadium, that moment, it just went absolutely mad. And I don't quite think I've seen that before or since, although I think when Lee Holmes scored direct from a corner against Liverpool last season, that was probably not far off it. The atmosphere that night was certainly sensational.
Superb, covered atmospheres there. I just wanted to come back quickly to a point you made earlier about coming with your family. And obviously you first came here sort of as a young man from university. So you come in here in sort of many guises. I'm assuming you've always felt welcome here. So just talk something about the character of the football club to you, sort of through the generations.
I don't think I'm alone by a long chalk to get absolutely besotted with Exeter City through coming to university here. I mean, I used to watch with a lot of students. A lot of us used to come and watch and stand on the big bank. I can remember going to away matches as well. And just, I think it's one of the great things about being situated in a university city, so close to the university. I think there's a real link, and a lot of people, that's how they come across Exeter City. And if it's doesn't become your favourite team, there's an awful lot of people who it's their second favourite team, and they watch out for City, and wherever they go in the world, they'll always have a bit of City in them. So that my introduction was very much through being a university student here. As it happened, then I decided to live in Exeter, got a job here, got married, had a family, and so then it becomes your local team for real. And over the years, brought my family here, brought my girls, stood in the old cow shed, and learned words I never wanted them to learn, and asked me questions about the words that I didn't want to deal with, but hey, that's football. And more latterly, my wife Anne, she's got more and more interested, so we're both season ticket holders now. So, you do go on a personal journey with football. Sometimes, at various times in my life, I've watched less and more football according to commitments, and but I think I probably, like a lot of people, I was in many ways rejuvenated by the conference years, when we just felt different. It was our football club, we owned our football club, and I think we're still living off that kind of feeling of this is our club.
Fantastic. Now here's a tricky one. So as succinctly as you can, thinking about Exeter City through its history and as it is now, how would you describe Exeter City Football
Club? I think we're a much-loved club situated in the heart of the city, of the community. I think traditionally we've always been a lower league club, with everything that goes with that, and there's a lot of good. It's real football. But there's a lot of heartache as well, because you must be losing quite a few games if you're still tend to be down the bottom of the league. But it's got character, it's real, and we own it.
Nice, very good. I had one more, and I keep meaning to ask it, and it keeps escaping me.
Can I ask one?
Yeah, of course you can.
So I just want to know what you sort of think of the development, and specifically, would you sort of miss the stand, or what's good about it, what's positive, things like that?
I think stadium change is inevitable. It's one of those. I'm a traditionalist. I love heritage, but you know, if you never changed anything at all, we'd still be playing on a field with a rope round it, and the pigs would be coming after the match to eat the grass, and it just it is a reality. You have to change things. Things grow old. I mean, I love this old grandstand, but it is old. It isn't fit for purpose anymore. And so I think it is exciting that we've got redevelopment plans that will look to develop the stadium, develop this part of the stadium, but still in a way that keeps the unique flavour of the ground with different stands, different vistas. I think it's very much in keeping with our history. The third old grandstand to emerge.